In your TrickFlow spring upgrade kit, you will find a single spring and a dampener. You'll find a retainer, valve seals, locks, and shims. 30 thousandths and 15 thousandths. Those are the main components of your spring upgrade kit. One special note, even though your retainers are specific to intake and exhaust, as the packaging suggests, your springs are not specific to intake and exhaust. They're also not specific on whether they're mounted, in which direction they're mounted. So, can't mess that up. That's nice. Okay, today's project, we're going to be replacing the stock valve springs on a GT40P head on a Ford Explorer motor with a set of TrickFlow aftermarket springs that match a TFS1 camshaft. So as you can see, we have the stock Explorer or GT40 valve springs there in place here on cylinder number 1. I've already replaced cylinder number 3. So here's what the new valve springs, here we go. Here's what the new valve springs look like. Both the intake and exhaust have been done. On this particular kit, the intake and exhaust retainers are different. You can see the exhaust has a deeper recess for the locks. So that's important that you keep that in mind so that you do not have the wrong installed height on your springs, if you mix up the retainers. So anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to pressurize cylinder number 1 here using a hose that goes to an air compressor, and that way the valves don't drop when I take the old valve springs off. And then we'll measure installed height, add shims if needed, and install our new valve springs, locks, and retainers, and valve seals. Can't forget about the valve seals. So the first thing we do after we pressurize the cylinder is we use a valve spring compressor. This is a pretty standard one. There's fancier ones out there. This one's a little more work because you have to hand crank everything, but that's okay. It's what I have. So I'm going to use it. So here we're just going to go ahead and compress that spring. We're going to tap down this lock holder and pull out our locks, which will allow us to remove the spring completely off the valve. Okay? Now that we've removed the locks, which you can see here in my hand, now it should be very, very easy to just go ahead and pull out the entire valve spring there. And you've got to be very careful just in case that shoots off. So keep it in a direction that's not going to kill anybody or poke anybody's eye out and injure them. So now you can see we just have the valve stem coming out of the valve guide of the head with an old valve seal there that needs to be removed. Okay, now you can see here on cylinder number 1 we have the intake valve spring, original valve spring completely removed, and we have the valve protruding out of the valve guide here on the cylinder head. So what we're going to do next is we're going to install our intake retainer and lock set, and we're going to measure the installed height to see if we need any shims to get the correct installed height of 1.8 inches. Okay, so what we have here is the retainer is in place and the locks are in place, and I've pushed the retainer all the way up as far as it will go. I'm going to use this supplied measurement device. It's exactly 1.8 inches, which I've confirmed with my digital caliper, and I just put it in place here in between the spring cup, you could call it, where the spring sits, and the top of the retainer. And it's going to be hard for you to see, but we do have a slight gap. So what I will use is a feeler gauge set to measure how much, a feeler gauge set at the top of this measurement tool to see how much gap there is. And as you can see, I can wiggle it back and forth. Looks to me to be between 30 and 40 thousandths, but that's just a guess, so I'll use a filler gauge to measure that gap, and then I'll use shims to fill that gap to have the correct installed height on the intake valve spring. Okay, we're going to go ahead and install our valve seals. The first thing you do is you slide on this protective cover over the valve stem, and this protects your valve seal from getting damaged as you slide it over the valve stem. It's also nice to put a little oil on it to help guide the seal over. Push the seal down all the way onto the valve guide, and it's going to be a pretty tight fit. Remove your protective sleeve. And what I do is I just get a socket, just get a ratchet socket, and one that fits over the valve stem and will be the right diameter for the top of the seal. And then just get yourself like a rubber mallet, something that's not going to be too jarring, and just give it a few taps and tap that new valve seal over the valve guide. It will fit pretty snug, and the whole idea here is that you do not have that valve seal come out of place or move when the valve is opening and closing. Okay, here's my new TrickFlow valve spring. You can see that I inserted the correct retainer, which is right there. And I just go ahead and I set it at on the top of the spring. On these springs there is no top and bottom, so that's kind of nice. The springs also have what's called a dampener spring on the inside. So it's not a true dual spring, but it is a single spring with a dampener. And as long as I've installed my retainer, the correct intake retainer for the spring, I've compressed it with the spring compressor, and I'm ready to set it in place and toss in my locks, and then decompress the spring and be finished with cylinder number 1. Another tip I wanted to share for beginners who are new to building engines, when you're trying to figure out just which is the intake and which is the exhaust valve, there's a neat little trick just to help you, just to be a reminder to you. If you look here at the outside of the cylinder head, you'll find exhaust ports or your exhaust flows out of the engine. Well, the exhaust port is always in line with your exhaust valve. So if you're looking for a way to quickly just check to make sure you know which valve you're working on, whether it's an intake or exhaust, just look for the exhaust port. When you're setting up an engine, there's some things you need to be aware of when it comes to valve springs. One of them is when you have your new valve seal in place, which is here, and you have your retainer, which is in place with the locks, which are there. The valve stem that you can see here, the part of the valve that you can see here, that's your actual travel that the valve where the valve can move. Because if you could picture this valve moving down, the top of this, actually it's the bottom. The bottom of the retainer eventually could bottom out against the top of your seal. So this is your travel. So, the distance from the bottom of the retainer to the top of the seal is your maximum lift that your cam can have. Now this happens to be an exhaust valve, and this is 0.673 or 673 lift travel. Now this cam isn't anywhere near that, so it's not a big deal. But you need to check that, because if you have a lot less travel here, or if your cam is bigger than this travel, you're going to run into some major coil bind problems. Just to give an idea of just all the little steps that it takes and what it looks like to change an intake and exhaust valve spring, I'm going to do kind of like a sped up version where I just kind of go through and quickly do everything and fast forward the tape so you can see all the steps. I'm going to start with installing this little adapter into the spark plug hole so that I can pressurize the cylinder so that I don't drop any valves. That's going to be really important. Otherwise, I'll be pulling these heads off when I really don't want to. So I'll start with this step because that really is the first step. And that's that.